Blood pressure spiked in the stifling courtroom as the millionaire attorney leaned over the podium, sneering at the frail old man on the witness stand. He thought he had cornered an easy target. He didn't know the presiding judge was staring at a highly classified military dossier, or that this quiet grandfather was an absolute American legend. Arian James Butler was not a man who startled easily. At 78 years old, his hands were mapped, with the deep, permanent creases of a life lived outdoors, his knuckles thick and scarred. He spent his Tuesday mornings exactly the same way he had for the past 40 years, tending to the heirloom tomatoes and climbing roses that wrapped around the porch of his modest wood-paneled cabin in the rural outskirts of Deschutes County, Oregon. The cabin was small, weathered, and entirely paid for. It sat on exactly 1.5 acres of prime elevated land that happened to overlook the sprawling multi-million-dollar construction site of the new Whispering Pines Golf and Country Club. The intrusion began with the aggressive guttural roar of a high-performance engine. A sleek silver Aston Martin tore down the 2-lane gravel road, kicking up an obnoxious cloud of dust that settled over Arian's meticulously pruned rose bushes. The car skidded to a halt mere inches from Arian's wooden property marker. Out stepped Rehan Gregory Porter. Rehan was the kind of man whose entire existence seemed engineered to intimidate. He wore a bespoke charcoal-grey Brioni suit that easily cost more than the roof over Arian's head. His shoes were polished Italian leather, and on his left wrist sat a heavy gold Patek Philippe watch that caught the morning sun like a weapon. As a senior partner at Vanguard and Hayes Portland's most ruthless corporate litigation firm, Rehan had built a career on burying small-time landowners, crushing independent businesses, and paving the way for corporate monopolies. He had never lost a civil encroachment case. He didn't plan on starting today. Rehan slammed the heavy car door, adjusting his silk tie with a sharp, impatient tug. He didn't walk. He marched toward the porch, his eyes sweeping over Arian's faded flannel shirt, worn denim jeans, and the simple scuffed work boots on his feet. Rehan's face twisted into a mask of thinly veiled disgust. "Mr. Butler, I presume," Rehan barked, not bothering to extend a hand. Arian slowly set down his gardening shears. He wiped his hands on a rag, his pale blue eyes locking onto the younger man. He didn't speak. He just nodded, a slow, deliberate motion. "My name is Rehan Porter. I represent Vanguard Developments. We own the 300 acres surrounding your quaint little shack here," Rehan said, waving a manicured hand dismissively at the cabin. "I'm not going to waste my morning, old man. Your fence line on the eastern ridge extends roughly 12 feet into my client's property. You are encroaching on land earmarked for the 14th hole of a championship golf course." Arian finally spoke. His voice was low, gravelly, and completely devoid of panic. "I bought this land in 1982. Had the county surveyor come out himself. The fence is exactly where it's supposed to be." Rehan let out a short, barking laugh. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, slapping them against the wooden railing of Arian's porch. "That was 40 years ago. We had a modern topographical satellite survey done last week. You are trespassing. Now my client is feeling generous. They are willing to offer you a flat $50,000 to vacate this property entirely within 30 days. Take the money move into a nice little retirement home and let progress happen." Arian looked at the paperwork, then back at Rehan. "This is my home. I built that porch with my own hands. I buried my wife under the oak tree out back. It's not for sale." Rehan's fake smile vanished, replaced by a cold, predatory glare. He leaned in, closing the distance between them, trying to use his height to tower over the older man. "Listen to me very carefully, Mr. Butler. This isn't a negotiation. It's an ultimatum. If you refuse this offer, I will drag you into civil court. I will file motion after motion, injunction after injunction. I will drown you in so much legal debt that you will be forced to sell this land just to pay your attorney's fees. I will take this house, and you will walk away with absolutely nothing." Arian didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He simply looked at Rehan with a gaze so intensely calm, it was almost unsettling. "I've faced a lot worse than paperwork, son. Have a good morning. Drive safe on the gravel." Arian turned his back on the millionaire lawyer and picked up his shears. Rehan's face flushed dark red with fury. He was used to panic. He was used to tears. He was not used to being dismissed like an annoying telemarketer. "You just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic life, old man," Rehan spat, spinning on his heel. "I'll see you in court." 6 weeks later, the atmosphere inside Department 4 of the Deschutes County Courthouse was suffocatingly tense. The mahogany walls seemed to close in around the sparse gallery. At the front of the room, seated high on the bench, was Judge Titus William Mendoza. Judge Mendoza was a man of fierce reputation. In his early 60s, with silver hair cropped close to his scalp and a permanent scowl etched into his features, Mendoza tolerated zero nonsense in his courtroom. He demanded absolute decorum and despised lawyers who used the legal system as a bludgeon against the defenseless. However, the law was the law, and Rehan Porter knew exactly how to manipulate it. Arian Butler sat completely alone at the defendant's table. He wore a simple dark navy suit that was cleanly pressed, but clearly decades out of style. He had no lawyer. He couldn't afford Vanguard and Hayes's aggressive pre-trial financial warfare, so he was appearing pro se, representing himself. Across the aisle, Rehan Porter had essentially set up a command center. He sat with 2 junior associates, flanked by bankers' boxes full of exhibit surveys and legal precedents. Rehan looked incredibly smug. He had spent the last month digging into Arian's background, looking for anything to destroy the old man's credibility before the judge. "Your Honor," Rehan began, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket as he strutted toward the center of the room. "This is a simple case of adverse possession and malicious trespass. The defendant, Mr. Butler, is an obstinate squatter who refuses to acknowledge modern, undisputed cartographic evidence. Furthermore, we intend to prove that Mr. Butler's refusal is not based on sentimental attachment, but rather an ongoing pattern of erratic antisocial behavior designed to extort my client." Judge Mendoza peered over his reading glasses, his brow furrowed. "That is quite a bold characterization, Mr. Porter. Let's stick to the property lines, shall we? With respect, Your Honor, the credibility of the defendant is paramount." Rehan shot back smoothly. "I call Arian Butler to the stand." Arian stood up slowly. His joints ached, a residual gift from decades past, but his posture was remarkably straight. He walked to the witness box, placed his hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down. Rehan approached the stand like a shark circling a wounded seal. He started with the property drilling Arian on property taxes, boundary lines, and technical jargon designed to confuse the old man. Arian answered simply and honestly, never raising his voice, never taking the bait. Frustrated that Arian wasn't breaking, Rehan pivoted. He walked back to his table and snatched up a manila folder. "Mr. Butler, you claim to be a hard-working, law-abiding citizen, an upstanding member of this community," Rehan said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Yet when my investigators looked into your background, we found a very different story. We found a ghost. No steady employment history for a decade in the late 60s and 70s. Moving from place to place, so we submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the federal government to see what you were really up to during those years. Arian's jaw tightened infinitesimally. For the first time, a flicker of something, not fear, but a profound, dangerous stillness crossed his eyes. Judge Mendoza frowned. "Mr. Porter, where are you going with this? This is a property dispute." "It goes to character, Your Honor," Rehan insisted loudly. He turned back to Arian, waving a stack of papers covered in heavy black redaction blocks. "I have here your military service record, Mr. Butler, or should I say what's left of it? It's almost entirely blacked out. The Department of Defense heavily censors the files of individuals discharged for severe misconduct, criminal activity, or psychiatric instability." Rehan leaned against the wooden rail of the witness box, invading Orian's space. "Look at this old man. Years of your life just erased. Blank. No commendations. No honorable mentions. Just a trail of black ink. Were you court-martialed, Mr. Butler? Did you strike a superior officer? Did you steal from your unit? Or were you just so incompetent that the military decided to wipe you from their books to save themselves the embarrassment?" Silence hung in the courtroom. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her stenograph. Arian looked at the redacted pages in Rehan's hand. He recognized the shape of those black blocks. He remembered the jungles of the Aishao Valley. He remembered the deafening roar of the Huey helicopters, the smell of cordite, the desperate screams of men who had trusted him with their lives. He remembered the classified cross-border operations into Cambodia with MACVSOG, the mission so deeply buried by the Pentagon that even his own family was told he was merely a desk clerk in Saigon. Arian looked Rehan dead in the eye. "My record is redacted because the men I served with and the places we went do not exist on public maps, Mr. Porter. I served my country. That is all you need to know." "Oh, spare me the tough guy routine." Rehan exploded, throwing his arms wide, playing to the empty gallery and the judge. "You served your country. You expect us to believe you were some kind of secret agent? You're an unemployed, uneducated squatter. Living in a shack, you're a nobody. You were probably a glorified latrine cleaner who got caught stealing rations." "Mr. Porter!" Judge Mendoza's voice cracked like a whip across the room. The judge had half risen from his leather chair, his face thunderous. "I'm just exposing the truth." "Your Honor," Rehan shouted back, high on his own arrogance. "This man is a fraud. He has no money, no legacy, and no right to occupy that land. His life is a blank page because he has achieved absolutely nothing of value." Rehan slammed the redacted file down on the edge of the judge's bench for emphasis. "Look at it yourself, Judge. The man is a total fabrication." Judge Titus Mendoza looked down at the file. He reached out and opened the folder. The first page was exactly as Porter had described, solid black lines of redaction. But as Judge Mendoza turned to the second page, something caught his eye. A small, unredacted, alphanumeric code in the top right corner of a supplemental document. Code M, ACV-SOG-CCN-71-MOH. The color completely drained from Judge Mendoza's face. He turned the page again. This time he found an unredacted internal memorandum, a summary page mistakenly included by the clerk who had processed the FOIA request. It wasn't meant for civilian eyes. Judge Mendoza began to read the text. His hands, usually steady, began to tremble. Subject: Sergeant First Class, Arian J. Butler, Unit Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group, MACVSOG, Command and Control North, Action, Battle of Hill, 875, Dak To. status sole survivor of a 5-man recon team. Under heavy enemy fire, SFC Butler single-handedly held off a battalion-sized NVA element for 36 hours. Butler sustained 3 gunshot wounds and shrapnel injuries, but successfully extracted 4 critically wounded Allied personnel. Awarded the Medal of Honor presented in closed session by the President of the United States. File sealed by order of the Department of Defense. The judge stopped reading. The courtroom was dead silent. Rehan Porter was smirking, adjusting his tie, waiting for the judge to agree with him and dismiss the old man. Judge Mendoza slowly lifted his head. He looked past the expensive lawyer, past the banker's boxes, and locked eyes with the quiet, frail old man sitting in the witness stand, the man with the cheap suit and the calloused hands. For a full 30 seconds, nobody breathed. The silence inside Department 4 was no longer just tense. It was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic hum of the courthouse air conditioning unit and the frantic, shallow breathing of Rehan Porter's junior associates, who seemed to sense the atmospheric shift before their boss did. Judge Titus William Mendoza sat frozen. His eyes remained locked on the weathered, stoic face of Orion James Butler. The old man sat in the witness box with the same quiet dignity he had maintained since the moment he walked into the room. He didn't look proud. He didn't look vindicated. He simply looked tired, like a man who had spent a lifetime carrying a ghost town on his shoulders. Rehan Porter, oblivious to the catastrophic reality unfolding on the bench above him, mistook the judge's silence for agreement. He leaned heavily against his counsel table, a victorious smirk stretching across his face. "As you can clearly see, Your Honor," Rehan said, his voice slicing through the quiet room, "the defendant has no standing, no credibility, and a history so marred by military failure that the federal government had to black it out. We request immediate summary judgment in favor of Vanguard developments. Let's evict this squatter and be done with it." Judge Mendoza slowly lowered the manila folder to his desk. He deliberately removed his reading glasses, folding the earpieces with a sharp, loud snap that echoed like a gunshot. "Mr. Porter," Judge Mendoza began, his voice dropping an octave, rumbling with a suppressed fury that made the court reporter physically flinch. "Before you walked into my courtroom today, did you bother to personally review this entire file, or did you just skim the redacted pages to fuel your arrogant little theater production?" Rehan's smirk faltered. He blinked confusion, replacing his manufactured confidence. I reviewed the pertinent sections, Your Honor. The blacked-out pages clearly indicate a less than honorable separation from service. The implication is obvious. The implication, Judge Mendoza said, his voice rising, is that you are a remarkably foolish young man who has just committed professional suicide on the public record. Rehan took a step back, his face draining of color. Your Honor, I object to that characterization. My client. Sit down and shut your mouth, Mr. Porter, Judge Mendoza roared. The sheer volume of the command rattled the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. The bailiff, who had been leaning casually against the wall, instantly snapped to attention, his hand instinctively dropping to his utility belt. Rehan dropped into his leather chair as if his legs had been kicked out from under him. He stared up at the bench, wide-eyed and trembling. Judge Mendoza picked up the unredacted summary page. His hands were no longer shaking. They were gripped tight with righteous anger. He looked directly at Orion Butler. The old man met his gaze, his pale blue eyes clear and unwavering. Mr. Butler? Judge Mendoza said, his tone shifting instantly from wrathful to profoundly respectful. I am holding a mistakenly unclassified summary memorandum from the Department of Defense routed through the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, specifically the Studies and Observations Group, MACVSOG. At the mention of the acronym, the courtroom bailiff, a retired Marine, gasped audibly. "Is this your file, sir?" Judge Mendoza asked gently. Arian gave a single slow nod. "It is, Your Honor. Mr. Porter introduced this file into evidence to establish your character," Judge Mendoza said, turning his lethal gaze back to the plaintiff's table. "Since he opened the door, I am going to read it into the official court record." "Objection." Rehan squeaked, panic finally clawing its way up his throat. "Relevance that document was not meant for public dissemination. Your Honor, it's a clerical error." "Overruled," Judge Mendoza snapped. "You brought it in, Mr. Porter. You demanded we look at this man's life. Now you are going to sit there and listen to exactly who you just called a nobody." The judge cleared his throat, holding the paper up. The room was deathly still. Subject Sergeant First Class, Arian J. Butler. Judge Mendoza read his voice, echoing in the cavernous room. "Action Battle of Hill 875, Dak To, November 1967. Status sole survivor of a 5-man deep reconnaissance team." Rehan Porter's jaw went slack. The junior associates next to him stared at the floor, mortified. During a highly classified operation, deep behind enemy lines, the judge continued reading the harrowing details of the citation. Sergeant Butler's unit was ambushed by a battalion-sized element of the North Vietnamese Army. Over the course of 36 hours, despite sustaining 3 severe gunshot wounds to the torso and multiple shrapnel lacerations, Sergeant Butler refused to retreat. Judge Mendoza paused, swallowing hard. The emotion in his voice was raw and unfiltered. He single-handedly repelled multiple infantry assaults, coordinating broken radio transmissions for air support, danger close to his own position. When his ammunition was depleted, he engaged the enemy in close-quarters combat to protect the bodies of his fallen brothers. Upon arrival of extraction forces, Sergeant Butler, despite catastrophic blood loss, refused medical evacuation until he had personally carried his 4 critically wounded teammates to the landing zone. Tears were now openly streaming down the face of the court reporter. The bailiff stood at rigid attention, staring at Arian Butler with absolute, unadulterated awe. Judge Mendoza looked down at the final lines of the document. He took a deep, shuddering breath. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty, Sergeant First Class Arian J. Butler was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor presented in a closed, classified session by the President of the United States. The words hung in the air, heavy as lead. Medal of Honor, the absolute highest military decoration awarded by the United States government. A medal worn by men who usually came home in flag-draped coffins. And the man who possessed it was sitting in a cheap, out-of-style suit in Deschutes County, being berated by a corporate lawyer with a luxury watch. Rehan Porter looked like he was going to be sick. His customized Brioni suit suddenly seemed entirely too tight. He looked at Arian, then at the judge, his mind racing to find a legal loophole, a tactical retreat, anything to salvage the wreckage of his career. Your Honor, Rehan stammered, his voice weak and reedy. While the plaintiff acknowledges the defendant's historical military service, that does not change the modern typographical realities of the property line. The satellite survey. Are you entirely devoid of a human soul, mister? Porter Judge Mendoza interrupted his voice, dropping to a dangerous whisper. Do you truly believe I am going to let you evict a Medal of Honor recipient over a 12-foot discrepancy on a luxury golf course. "The law is the law, Your Honor." Rehan pleaded, desperate to cling to the only weapon he understood. "We have the deed. We have the survey. And Mr. Butler has 40 years of undisputed, open, continuous, and notorious occupation of that land." Judge Mendoza fired back instantly, shifting seamlessly into legal executioner mode. In the state of Oregon, the statute for adverse possession is 10 years. Mr. Butler has been maintaining that fence line, paying taxes on the perceived acreage, and living on that exact footprint for 4 decades. Your modern satellite survey is legally irrelevant under the doctrine of practical location. Rehan opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. He was completely outmatched. Furthermore, Judge Mendoza continued, his voice echoing like thunder. "Your conduct in this courtroom today, your baseless character, assassination, your attempts to humiliate an elderly man, and your staggering lack of ethical diligence is a disgrace to the Oregon State Bar. You did not just attempt to win a case, Mr. Porter. You attempted to destroy a man's dignity to save your billionaire clients a few pennies." The judge picked up his wooden gavel. "Vanguard Development's motion for eviction and injunction is denied," Judge Mendoza declared. "This case is dismissed with prejudice. You cannot refile. The property line stands exactly where Mr. Butler built his fence 40 years ago. And if I hear even a whisper that your firm is harassing this man with appeals or intimidation tactics, I will hold you personally in criminal contempt." Bang! The gavel struck the sounding block with finality. Rehan Porter slowly sank back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. His junior associates were already quietly packing their briefcases, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. Arian Butler didn't cheer. He didn't gloat. He simply let out a long, quiet sigh, the tension finally leaving his old, tired shoulders. He stood up slowly, adjusting the lapels of his worn navy suit, and prepared to walk out of the courtroom and go back to his roses. "Mr. Butler," Judge Mendoza called out softly. Arian stopped halfway down the aisle and turned around. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Titus William Mendoza stood up. He bypassed the stairs, stepping out from behind the heavy mahogany bench so that he was standing in full view of the courtroom. He smoothed down the front of his black judicial robes. He looked at the frail old man who had bled into the dirt of a foreign jungle so that men in expensive suits could argue in air-conditioned rooms. He thought about the 36 hours of hell Arian had endured. He thought about the ghost town of fallen friends Arian carried with him every day. The judge brought his right hand up in a crisp, razor-sharp military salute. Behind Arian, the bailiff snapped his heels together. The heavy thud echoed loudly in the quiet room as the bailiff, too, raised a rigid hand to his brow. Arian stood frozen for a fraction of a second. He hadn't worn a uniform in half a century. He hadn't been acknowledged for his service in decades, actively hiding from the glory that he felt belonged only to the men he couldn't save. But looking at the judge, seeing the absolute reverence in the man's eyes, Arian understood. This wasn't about the property. It was about respect. Slowly fighting the ache in his joints, Arian straightened his back. He raised his chin. The years seemed to melt away, revealing the steel spine of the young sergeant who had held the line at Dacto. Arian James Butler returned the salute. They held it for 3 long seconds. A silent understanding passed between them, a recognition of sacrifice duty, and the enduring strength of quiet men. Arian lowered his hand, gave a small appreciative nod to the judge and the bailiff, and turned around. He walked out of the heavy double doors of the courtroom, leaving the arrogant millionaire lawyer and the ruined case behind him. He had a long drive back to Deschutes County, and his heirloom tomatoes needed watering. If this incredible story of quiet heroism, absolute justice, and putting arrogance in its place moved you, please hit that like button. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and family to remind everyone the true heroes walk among us every single day. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful real-life story of triumph and inspiration. Thank you for watching.